biggest problem that President Reagan had with communism, the fundamental problem, was that it compromised American freedom, and there was no peace worth making if we had to compromise our freedom. If the Berlin Wall, the reason why it had to be torn down, the reason why he wanted Mr. Gorbachev to open up that gate was because it was an encumbrance to human freedom.
President Reagan went to Berlin to a ceremony celebrating the 750th anniversary of the city. He wanted to give a momentous speech, meeting the moment. Interesting enough, he had visited, Berlin previously. He saw, of course, the bustling West Berlin as a metropolis. And when he went into the eastern side of the city, Ronald Reagan saw the horrors of communism firsthand. His future national security advisor, Richard Allen, later said that the president looked at him at the conclusion of that tour and said, "Dick, we've really got to find a way to knock this thing down."
Well, President Reagan early on wanted to win the Cold War. His theory of the Cold War is we win, they lose. His view was that it was something fundamentally unnatural about the Soviet Union, fundamentally immoral about communism, and therefore the Soviet Union should not and could not exist. And his outlook was that the United States was actually on the losing side of détente.
He wanted to be, I think, more aggressive. He wanted to make sure he had rebuilt the military so we were always operating from a position of strength. Because he was able to do that, I think he was able to engage in some daring diplomacy. If you hold out or have the credible use of force, it strengthens your hand in negotiations.
By the time we get to the tear down this wall speech, President Reagan had realized the military buildup was on the cusp of breaking the Soviet Union and knew that Mikhail Gorbachev, the General Secretary of the Soviet Union, needed to make a deal because he couldn't compete with the United States. So it was a moment where President Reagan was at maximum leverage, and he knew he could press his case at the most consequential flashpoint of the Cold War.
From devastation, from utter ruin, you Berliners have in freedom rebuilt a city that once again ranks as one of the greatest on earth.
I think Ronald Reagan sort of advanced the cause of freedom in the speech through his soaring rhetoric. It's an appeal, I think, to our better nature, and it's inspiring. That was part of Ronald Reagan's efforts to introduce sort of the ideological pockets of this competition and talk about how ultimately it wasn't only about the security of the United States and the collapse of a Soviet military. It was about advancing the cause of freedom worldwide.
We in the West must resist Soviet expansion. So we must maintain defenses of unassailable strength. Yet we seek peace.
There you have a line that reflects President Reagan's approach to peace through strength. And that was because President Reagan elsewhere had stated that there were only two things that he would never give up, and that was freedom and the future. And he felt that if the United States were to give up its ability to develop the Strategic Defense Initiative, which of course is missile defense and a means of protecting the United States from nuclear weapons, then we would be giving up our freedom and our future. And of course, the biggest problem that President Reagan had with communism, the fundamental problem, was that it compromised American freedom, and there was no peace worth making if we had to compromise our freedom. If the Berlin Wall, the reason why it had to be torn down, the reason why he wanted Mr. Gorbachev to open up that gate was because it was an encumbrance to human freedom.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
If you've worked in the executive branch, these speeches are circulated in different parts of the government, examine it, and 7 times, in 7 different drafts, Ronald Reagan's phrase of Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, was struck. And it was Ronald Reagan who each time put it back in. The reason some struck it was because they thought it was too provocative. However, I think the president, of course, felt so strongly about it. And it was momentous because here was a president of the United States visiting Berlin and issuing a clarion call for freedom beyond the wall and behind the Iron Curtain.
President Reagan reminded everybody involved that a moral lens needed to be applied to the very spot in which he stood on June 12, 1987, and reminding everybody in Berlin that it was unnatural and it needed to return to its natural state with no wall between East and West, and ultimately Berlin becoming united again. And the tragedy of families being divided, of one side being free and the other side being oppressed. That clarity, that moral lens, of course, was very much the heart of President Reagan's outlook as it related to the Cold War, the Soviet Union, and more broadly to American foreign policy and the way it approached geopolitics.
If you look forward to the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the footage that I remember of Berliners tearing the wall down, in some cases even with their hands, you begin to look what immediately preceded it. There's the accession of Mikhail Gorbachev, but there's also Ronald Reagan's defense buildup. There's also Ronald Reagan's speech. And then ultimately, as you sort of view this era of history, you see the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. And so it's just within that timeline of events, of immediate precursors to the momentous destruction of the Berlin Wall, that people even began to reflect even more on what Ronald Reagan had said on that anniversary of Berlin.
I think this speech is part of a larger legacy. I think President Reagan, as someone who lived through, especially the Second World War, understood that if the United States were to stand by, where the United States were to retreat just to within its sovereign borders, that would put American freedom at risk. Our freedom couldn't afford just to stay at home and retreat from the world. And so we needed to be in the business of supporting, backing, and standing with free peoples around the world. That, in President Reagan's mind, was essential to American freedom. And that was really, in many ways, his unique contribution to American foreign policy. And that, I think, is quite relevant to dealing with the People's Republic of China.
I think the speech still has resonance today because there are a variety of different powers that the United States is coping with. Of course, the biggest is China. And again, just like in the Soviet Union context, military strength is a big part of that. Allies are a big part of that. But it's really something that helps the American cause when we're able to articulate a vision of freedom. It shows that it's not just a battle between two big, bad, bruising countries. The ideological dimension of freedom and its inexorable march forward, I think, is a strong wind at our backs and differentiates us from what the Chinese Communist Party's message is. Because in the end, not only are we pushing and selling security and prosperity, but we're also pushing freedom